So in recent times, this whole ADHD thing has become more, I won't say popular, I won't say prevalent, I would say more aware. It's being talked about more. The professionals say that there could be maybe up to 10%, a bit under, of people who have ADHD. This episode today, we are talking about ADHD in adults. If you have recently been diagnosed, if you have heard some of the symptoms and you're a bit curious how money and impulsivity can kind of not work together when you may be working through this ADHD thing. But the purpose of today's episode is really just to have a discussion with a professional psychologist about this topic. I'm joined today by Johanna Badenhorst. Johanna is a mother of 2 boys. She's an educational development psychologist and director of holistic wellness psychology. She has a profound passion for all things ADHD and perinatal mental health. Johanna started her own psychology practice in Brisbane last year and launched the ADHD Her Way podcast earlier this year. Like many women, Johanna had a late diagnosis of ADHD herself, so her own lived experiences have fueled her passion for ADHD advocacy and to support other ADHD women experiencing chaos to find clarity and community. Today's episode is brought to you by Sky Wealth. I want you to know that everything you do with your life revolves around money. Well, most of it. Have a think about it. Everything that you're doing, whether you're driving to work, you need money to get to work. You need fuel for the car. You need money for transport. You need money to eat. You need it for rent. You need it for mortgage repayments. Everything we do in our life, unless you're living on a farm and you're listening to this from 1822 and you're self-sufficient and all that stuff, money, you need money, but you need to protect that money. So I want you, if you do not have income insurance, you need to reach out to Sky Wealth, skye.com.au, have a 15-minute complimentary chat with them just to work out the protection that you need for your life. If you've got debt and dependence, you need to chat to them to make sure your death cover is in place. So thank you to Sky Wealth for supporting the podcast today. That's skye.com.au. My name's Glen James. I'm joined by Johanna Badenhorst, and this is Money. Johanna Badenhorst, welcome to This Is Money.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so let's just dive straight in. What is ADHD?
Sure. So it's probably a condition that has been covered quite a bit, especially as of recent. However, it's also one of the more poorly understood conditions as well. So ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is essentially like a unique way that the brain actually operates. It's marked by differences in managing attention, executive functioning, and sometimes also an excess of energy. So it is a neurotype as opposed to, that's what we refer to it now, as opposed to like calling it a disorder as such. The preferred term is a neurotype. And so it's really just about us understanding that the brain has a different rhythm. It has a distinct rhythm and it functions differently to perhaps non-ADHDers brains, right? And so we bring kind of a unique set of cognitive skills to the table, which, yes, can be a struggle, but also can bring strengths as well. So we have many strengths and talents that I'd just like to just mention. Not a fan of the, ADHD makes you a superhero as such. Like, that can sometimes be a bit dismissive, but that gets thrown around as well. And I guess it's whatever you feel like is helpful. But people with ADHD can be incredibly creative. They think outside the conventional box. They can be, really great problem solvers, but it needs to probably be things that capture their interest. That's, I guess, the kicker there. So can be hard, but lots of vibrant energy, usually quite a lot of enthusiasm. And if channeled right, it can be like, an opportunity for great groundbreaking innovations and accomplishments. But we have to acknowledge that too. It comes with, yes, a lot of challenges and focusing on especially attention and consistently focusing on one task specifically. So think of it as like a surplus of attention that is really tricky to then, be used effectively on the single task, and not as much of a deficit that it kind of typically is known as. Hopefully that gave you a bit of an intro.
Yeah. And, are there any, is it just one type? Are there subtypes? Are there blends?
Sure. So the listeners may be familiar with ADHD, but there's three types. So there's predominantly inattentive presentation, predominantly hyperactive, impulsive presentation, and then the combined type. So underneath that one neurotype, there is of ADHD, there's other kind of subtypes, and majority of people would fall under the combined, but their symptoms may not be so clear and present necessarily. For majority of women, it's likely that they would be diagnosed with predominantly inattentive type, because a lot of their symptoms are often internalized but also misunderstood. So it's very possible that historically they may have been diagnosed as inattentive, but actually there is hyperactive symptoms present. They're just very internalized. And the same, it's not necessarily just a gendered conversation. It's anyone who usually presents much more internalizing with their symptoms. They would typically be going undiagnosed for a long time, perhaps. It's usually the hyperactive types that I guess get picked up the quickest and the best, but not necessarily. Young boys, that's where often the conversation goes back to that. Unfortunately, the diagnostic criteria from the diagnostic manual that we are still using, it's a bit limited, and it's been largely influenced by the research that has historically been collected about young boys as opposed to women and young girls or other minority groups. So yes, that's a big problem. And that's, I guess, where we can only do our best with what the information we have, but hopefully the diagnosis process will change, and it's very deficit focused as well. So that's, again, doesn't help those people who are quite good at masking their symptoms.
So, of the three types, if we kind of look at some of the hallmarks of ADHD, could you give us some practical examples of some of the behaviours or hallmarks of maybe the inattentive and the hyperactivity and combined?
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk to the ADHD and how it can show up in daily life. That's probably the easiest, as opposed to there is obviously, I can, mention what are more typically the inattentive symptoms and what are more typically the hyperactive. But the main key hallmarks are based around that ADHD can complicate time management, planning, executing tasks aimed at achieving specific goals. The way that it can manifest is like habitual procrastination, skewed perception of time, like what some call time blindness, trouble completing tasks or meeting deadlines, difficulty completing multiple tasks, simultaneously thinking that they're, doing a great job, that switch tasking, often starting newer tasks before finishing current ones. Struggles with self-discipline is typical, and also the frequent forgetfulness, like paying your bills, for example. There's a few more. So there's organization and working memory, problem solving. Individuals ADHD might find it really hard to focus on tasks, and especially those that, like I said before, don't spark their interests. And emotion regulation issues is quite a considerable one as well. Emotion control and regulation. So the experiencing the real quick shifts in emotion, such as anger and frustration. And then lastly, the motivation can be really notably affected as well. So often postponing things that, like, the long-term objectives maybe don't feel so gratifying and starting on tasks and having activities with sustained interest is really quite hard when there's no immediate reward. So that really plays into all this conversation quite well.
Yeah, so all of those things that you mentioned, if you've got inattentive or the hyperactivity, you may swing between these different ones. Or if you just have the inattentive one, you might be actually really good at planning but forgetful, like Just help me understand
Sure.
key differences between the two.
Nuance. Yeah, and I guess there's so much nuance to it. So
Yeah.
I suppose the biggest differences may be that someone who is the people with ADHD will all typically have issues with majority of these kinds of things. However, I guess the differences being that those with the more hyperactive types. So typically I would say there's inattentive subtypes on their own, and getting hyperactive on its own, the hyperactive impulsive subtype on its own is really quite rare. So you'll probably say majority would either identify very strongly with inattentive or the combined, probably much less so hyperactive. So that might help conceptualize it a little bit more. Those who say, yeah, I really identify with more the inattentive, like the sustained attention, those types of things, as well as, things around planning, organization, a lot of those executive functioning tasks still being very much present. Those specifically with the more hyperactive impulsive type as well, or the combined, they would probably be the type that would really struggle with impulsive spending and like the more hyperactivity and, the perhaps typically more externalized typical behaviors of real restless brain and that type of thing. So it is hard sometimes to really pull it apart when talking in this situation particularly. But yes, there is the combined who I guess encompasses all of those things that more commonly a lot of people would say, yeah, I really identify with quite a few, but some people just don't really identify with the impulsiveness. And maybe an all right budgeter or but those with impulsivity as well, they probably struggle the most, I'd say.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think we should call out, much like when we do a money podcast, you need to get your own advice. And particularly with this health stuff, we're blasting this to thousands of people. If you do feel that some of this might resonate with you or a loved one, I always recommend with health stuff, speak to your GP. Is that the first port of call you would say?
Yeah, it can. Yes, absolutely. The GP can be helpful, but there's a bit of a, I guess, important thing to note here is that not all GPs are really informed about ADHD as such. So try and find one that is, I guess, informed about ADHD. Otherwise, majority of psychologists and psychiatrists have an understanding of ADHD and would probably admit to that in their bio or whatever, if that, neurodiversity is something of interest to them or they're a neuroaffirming practitioner. Those will probably be the best people to go to. But yes, of course, start with a GP if that is someone you feel trusting, and they will be the one that needs to send a referral to a psychiatrist here in Australia.
Yeah. So that's it. If you do resonate with this, or if there's someone in your life, maybe a close partner, a friend, family member, child, and I will say we are talking about more adults in this podcast, but it's okay if you feel that you resonate with some of the things to speak to somebody about it. Don't get medical advice or financial advice from a podcast, but get encouraged from a podcast, get inspired to take action. Absolutely. So when we talk about ADHD and other mental conditions, I seem to be collecting all these mental conditions. I'm collecting depression. I got some anxiety. Yeah, I'll add ADHD to it. I mean, I'm having a rockin' time out here. But how do you, as a psychologist, if someone came to you with a condition that presented as maybe anxiety, maybe depression, maybe something else, and you were talking through it, is there an overlap of symptoms with ADHD with other medical diagnoses or mental diagnoses? And have you uncovered that, or are they stark differences?
Yeah, it's important to, talk to this as well, because the high correlation or coexisting mental health conditions along with ADHD is huge. So anxiety, depression, PTSD, complex PTSD, there is many that people also are diagnosed with alongside ADHD, but at times they're misdiagnosed with those initially when in fact it may be underlying ADHD and they're purely a presenting kind of symptomology because of the untreated ADHD. So that can be really common. And also those with ADHD are often diagnosed with autism as well. So they're autistic individuals about 50 to 70% of the time, as well as ADHD. So that is an important one to also know, because I think that historically it was probably only about in the last 10 years that we've kind of accepted that you can be autistic and also have ADHD. So that's huge. And that's, I guess, a development that, previously wasn't recognized so well. So the key differences being that when it comes to mental health conditions are something that's acquired, something that you, I suppose, would be diagnosed with because of, I guess, facing a type of struggle throughout your life because of a disability, or it can, what we call kind of that condition, that neurotype. If that is not accommodated for very well, that's when people may then feel quite depressed or very anxious, experience a lot of trauma because that it is not actually being managed by society very well. It's not maybe by the individual person not having that understanding. So that can be where we need to really, identify that there's neurodevelopmental conditions that we're dealing with here, which have been lifelong, but have been perhaps really masked very well. For some people, it's a change in hormones that they may present much later in life, but also the life that we like, kind of current living conditions, as you probably recognize, it's perhaps different to the financial, economic, everyone needs to work a lot more, and, mothers are working, juggling family life, and that may have not been the case. And so now they're starting to kind of maybe be diagnosed more, same with substance abuse and actual substance abuse kind of disorders are also, again, very highly correlated, and people self-medicating is a huge red flag, right? So those are all important.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't want to talk about me too much in this, but I'll mention it, particularly me being self-employed, I could mask a lot of the condition for many, many years because if I didn't feel like doing something, I wouldn't do it, and that's okay. There's no accountability. So that's also if you're self-employed and don't have many guardrails in your life, it can be masked a little bit, I guess. But back to the whole ADHD thing, and you probably don't know the answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Chicken or the egg? If I love mum and dad, but if they cuddled me a little bit more as a child and told me that they loved me and all that, would it have still presented? Do we know that? Is it a nature-nurture thing?
Yeah, so there's pretty strong evidence that it is like epigenetics, obviously, but very much that it's a genetic condition that, yes, through its environment, perhaps has, I guess, turned on that particular, set of genes or gene. They haven't tied it to any particular gene as such. We also know that very, very likely it would have showed regardless, but it's possible that you may have not been diagnosable at the time because it was managed quite well, right? So it's very possible that people can go through their life with ADHD or being autistic or any other type of neurotypes, and if well catered for, that probably they feel that they feel safe and they don't present with any mental health disorders as a result. So it's possible that, it would have showed up regardless of however your parents had treated you. But yes, those, I guess, in more traumatic upbringings, perhaps, that has a large part to play. And it is important to, I guess that's where the misunderstandings come from, is that everyone's getting diagnosed all of a sudden, or that it just came on later in life. It's still, we don't understand enough about it, what all the different, how it gets triggered, and that there's still a lot of, but yes, it's not through just being exposed to a bit too much metal from the research. It's not because of a lack of, cuddles or that attachment necessarily. So it's important. It's a good question though.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just it's funny, and I am, maybe I'll share it a bit later in the episode, but this diagnosis for me has been in concert with some other issues that have kind of been closely aligned, particularly around impulse control and whatnot. But when you are walking someone through the talk therapy or the psychotherapy techniques, particularly as an adult, because it's weird as an adult, I think it's harder to change that because we're so set in our ways. Like, what are some of the techniques that you might take a newly diagnosed adult through to help manage, notwithstanding that it could be with or without medication?
Yes, we do know that medication is one of the most effective ways of managing ADHD. For many, it is something that's really quite helpful. However, there's caveats, like it's not meant to be the fix all. It doesn't work for everyone. People feel unpleasant side effects at times. So it is important to explore that. However, and with the shortage too at the moment here in Australia and UK and America, that is causing a big problem for people. So people are needing to rely a lot more on managing it through other ways, so through therapy. And many people are choosing to go that direction because perhaps previously there was maybe, being on antidepressants for a long time, they're kind of scared about taking something different. So I'm totally open to, managing this holistically. And I really recommend that people do. So what I would say that there's no one hard, fast way of managing this, but something that helps is coming from a more neuroaffirming approach. So that meaning of like accepting that individual has a unique brain and exploring how they would like to, I guess, that, what techniques and that may be best fitting for them. We know of some of the techniques that may be quite accommodating and helpful, but expecting someone to complete a bunch of homework in between sessions, that may not be realistic. Just saying, just try and challenge, that way of thinking. For someone with ADHD who has 1,000, in 1 second, 1,000 thoughts going through their mind, probably at every second, that is really quite challenging. Be like, what, I don't know which thought you might be talking about here. So also there's other, we have to be aware that people with ADHD are typically more prone to feeling quite criticized and feeling rejected. So that is kind of all needing to be managed as well because of what we call rejection sensitive dysphoria. So they can be really quite sensitive in relationships and typically be like people pleasing type of clients as well. So I don't love that term. Those people pleasing tendencies do come up. So I probably rely quite a lot on more compassion focused therapy, like really taking into consideration a lot of self-compassion and the importance of that in terms of self-esteem. ACT and mindfulness I find incredibly helpful because it really focuses on values work and around creating this awareness about our feelings and thoughts and behaviors. And there's other good therapy styles that have more recently come out as being quite helpful for the neurodivergent population, like even schema therapy, which more works around cognitions, around attachment as well, and our frameworks we think out of. So has that CBT or cognitive behavioral flavor. But works on those cognitive beliefs that we hold really strong. And the other one that I have more recently started to delve into is EMDR. So that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and has been used for trauma a lot. So, but we know that people with neurodivergence, ADHD, do tend to experience more trauma than the person without ADHD. They have brains that are set like that. There's, the research has shown that the brains of those with ADHD actually look different. So there's actual brain differences that are, even picked up in brain scans. So, that psychoeducation is important as well. Making sure that clients understand, some of those those things about them that they may not otherwise really realize, or be like, oh, I didn't realize that, my perhaps dyslexia or my difficulty with writing and reading is actually another coexisting condition and is really highly correlated with ADHD. I thought I was just stupid and, I couldn't pay attention in class. And so bringing a lot of compassion and, self-understanding and psychoeducation from the therapist is really key.
Yeah. It's fascinating. If you are an adult and you have recently been through this process, knowing that you've experienced, so like I'm knocking on 40's door and I've experienced, say, the last 20 or more years of this chaos, this struggle, it really came to a head. I'm self-aware enough to know stuff, right? When I was reading my audiobook, it was the hardest thing I'd ever done in the world because I couldn't read for long periods out loud. And I kind of, after the first date, we were supposed to do 3 hours of reading, do 2 chapters. I think I did half a chapter. And I had to kind of go, why can't I do this? And then I thought, hang on, my eye is moving along faster than I'm actually speaking the words. So I've got a lot better at reading. And it's no, slow down. It's okay. It's not a race. Just move your eye as you speak.
Yeah.
And then all these little things, like there's anecdotal evidence that, there might be poor handwriting with someone with ADHD, right? And my handwriting's shocking. So, look, it's just been wild. And one thing you mentioned just before, and I did lean to it, that I've kind of been through some stuff. It's just interesting. In the end of January this year, I had a big, I'll call it a mental event. I had something happen that really, really impacted me. And a lot of the listeners may know that, a couple of months ago on a Thursday episode, we actually ran podcast episodes from other shows on this main show because I was very unwell mentally and I couldn't actually record or function, and it was the worst time. We were rebranding, but this event happened weirdly at the same time as receiving this diagnosis of ADHD, and it brought all this other stuff up. And now I got through the acute anxiety, and now I've been working with a psychologist. And actually, we're recording this on a Friday. In 2 hours, I'm doing another session, and I'm actually doing some schema therapy. Now, interestingly, and this was just blew my mind, right? Oh, it's so wild. The highest schema that I scored in was insufficient impulse control.
I was going to say that, yeah.
And I'm just like, this is rocking my world. And I've had this big emotional reckoning over the last few months, and I've learned more about myself and how I haven't been able to deal with relationships, and I withdraw and I'm impulsive and it's all or nothing, and it's a train wreck. But that's okay. We're getting there. Just a question. I actually don't know the answer because I've just heard the saying, and because I'm a bogan from Newcastle, is someone with ADHD considered neurodivergent?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I thought that was just autism.
No. So that's another neurotype. So autism is one neurotype and ADHD is another neurotype. And then there's also the dyslexic brain as well. And so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, they talk about the spectrum. You could say every human's on the spectrum because it's a spectrum, right?
Yeah, so that is, I guess, it gets a little lost in translation. And I think because it was previously autism was called ASD, autism spectrum disorder, especially here in Australia, we're moving away from the term of autism spectrum disorder because, again, there's a preference around it being called a neurotype instead, because the word disorder has, I guess, a really negative connotation to it. It's still meant, we haven't yet found perhaps a good alternative for ADHD. Yeah. So many just refer to it as that. But for autism, that's essentially what we refer to. And in terms of the spectrum, I think, again, that people may then start to say, I'm a bit ADHD, I'm a bit autistic, and that can be quite dismissive to those who actually are diagnosed with that. So yeah, just, I guess, for people to be mindful around that and not to maybe say, I'm a bit of this, I'm a bit of that, because that can be quite dismissive if actually you're just a bit forgetful at times and not truly identify with it. But
that's the same thing. Like, I was messaging a friend a couple of months ago and I was like, do you think I'm a narcissist? And she's like,
yeah.
She sent me this book she was literally reading at the time. And she's like, just answer all these questions. It was like a self-diagnosis. She's like, one, you're not, because I've dated one. But two, we all could have different traits of things, but doesn't mean you're that. And that's why I want people to go to their doctor if you do have some common traits that keep appearing in it. I think, and Johanna, maybe it is this thing, like, once it's disrupting your life, it's probably more of an issue than if it's not. But also just go to your GP.
Yeah, especially if you do notice that it's all about impairing your daily functioning, and for ADHD across several environments. So we can't just say, oh, it really shows up in here, but I don't otherwise experience it at all. Then it may not be something that is diagnosable, because it's maybe to do with the environment itself, and if accommodated better, or maybe it's a really toxic workplace, and then, you know, you end up being forgetful because you're extremely anxious, or you end up kind of missing things or avoiding things for those reasons. So that's, I guess, where it's important to, track it. You can just, start actually tracking some of those symptoms, look back in your schooling. That usually shows up in schooling in one way or another. Like, if it was around really a lot of overcompensating throughout school, like, some people may actually still done pretty well, or done really well because they're really quite perfectionistic, like myself included. I think it's important to go, well, it probably didn't show up very well, but I was also very chatty type of person, and so much so it would appear on every report card I had, basically. Yeah,
it was part of my diagnosis. I did a couple of hour session with a neuropsychologist first, and he got copies of my school report cards from like year 7 till 11, and some statements from my mum and my sister how I was at school, and as a 16-year-old, and it's funny, the report cards were like, Glen can lose attention and be distracted. That was like this common theme, and that's why I left school. I'm like, this is crap. I don't enjoy it. Peace out. And so I think before we go to a quick break, my view of the world and humanity, because we've got all these labels and all this, like, no one's actually perfect anyway. And if you're a human being and you're alive and living, everyone's got a disorder mentally or physically, because no one's perfect, right? I don't know if I have ever met someone who was perfectly physically and perfectly mentally. It doesn't exist. Humanity is messy. We are a subject of genetic makeup, social makeup, family vibes. So I don't know. I think there is grace there that no one is perfect.
Yeah, and that's right. Like, everyone has such, like, I maybe coming from the perspective too of like how everyone has unique brains, everyone interprets things entirely differently, and so it's really important to just accept that we all have different working brains, and it's no one that is better or worse. They're just different. They have different strengths, different kind of challenges, and that's, I guess, the most important thing.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll be back, and then we're going to talk about the money side of things. How do you manage money when you're living in chaos? Hello, my name's Glen James. How do I do it? I don't know. It's chaotic. It's wild. But you can get there, and we're going to talk about it right after this. Just before we dive back into the ADHD stuff, I just want to remind everyone, our newest podcast, Financially Fierce, hosted by Jessica Brady. She is financially fierce, and she wants you to be too. We've got a heap of podcasts. It's a different format show. If you don't like me, what are you still doing listening to this? But it's just an alternative. It's just Jess talking about different topics and just answering your questions. It's such a good product that we're producing. and it is to add value to your life. And if you want more money content, you can subscribe to Financially Fierce. Also, if you are over 50, or if you've got parents or loved ones in your life that are over 50, 55, we've got a podcast called Retire Right. Don't you tell them to sell the house and downsize because they don't need it and they're poor and don't have money and all that and they're living in chaos. Let us tell them. Send them the podcast Retire Right. Okay, so Johanna, before we get into the money stuff, and it probably does impact the money stuff anyway, and maybe I'll throw you a heap of questions and comments and you can just pick apart where to take it. So I've written down ADHD and the impact on romantic relationships and marriages, and around this spending money, saving money, ADHD, risks, opportunities, because life can get messy at the best of times, but you add something that's a bit chaotic or impulsive, and you get Glen James. No, joking, but not really. So how is that managed?
Yeah, okay. So interestingly, I've just done an episode, literally launched it today, around relationships and ADHD.
Awesome.
Didn't dive into specifically the money side of things here, but it was talking to a couples counselor, a couples therapist, and we talked about there's difficulty or differences in communication sometimes throughout, struggling with paying attention to conversations sometimes, or being distracted during conversations, or interrupting others, the more hyperactive types, challenges of, that being a problem, and misunderstanding each other at times. Because, and again, this is also with other neurodivergence weaved in here, it's more typical communication difficulties are probably more of an autistic trait. However, there can still be challenges when it comes to holding conversations, tuning out when it starts to talk about, money. And that's certainly one that I'm guilty of. I'm yeah. I'm not necessarily that interested. And so I tune out. Also, there's organizational stuff that can really impact the relationship, managing finances, keeping track of appointments, and staying on top of household tasks and bills, things like that. So it can really put a strain on the relationship if one or both of you aren't quite strong in that department around organization, planning, management. And that if one partner or both of you, again, are quite impulsive and risk-taking when it comes to financial decisions, that can really put the other person at constant vigilance of oh my goodness, one of, my husband, my wife is really spending all of our money we wanted to save for a house. This is really stressful. We can't get ahead now. And that really irresponsible and reckless behaviors can really put a strain on a person. And you can see people's relationships can fall apart as a result of that. So, and then of course, emotional dysregulation that may happen when hard conversations need to take place around finances. And if one of you is really quite avoidant, it can be quite upsetting, but also can really could kind of raise a lot of anxiety for the person, especially with, either with the ADHD or the partner, the individual with ADHD can become quite stressed when money talk starts to happen, because it's this is what I'm not, I don't feel good at. And I don't want to see, I don't want to see my constant, the impulse spends I've done, don't talk to me about it. This stresses me out. So if not managed well, it can lead into conflict and stuff like that. So yeah, those are probably some of the key ones that come to mind.
And how would you suggest, if I lobbed in on your virtual couch, because you will take clients anywhere in Australia, yeah?
That's right, yeah, I do telehealth and in person.
So if I lobbed in on your virtual couch and was hey, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD, I've got so much impulsivity when it comes to spending, could you give me some practical tools? Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, would you say the ADHD with money, there is more a risk of impulsivity than hoarding?
It can be both. What do you mean? Sorry, hoarding?
Oh, as in I'm too fearful
money
to spend and I'm just accruing and I can't make a decision and indecision and all that. Like, if you had to pick one, it would almost be the impulsivity that's might present as a bigger problem with managing money with ADHD. Is that fair, or
Yeah,
it depends?
probably. It probably depends. But there may be an overcompensating of never trusting yourself with it. So there might be like the opposite happening because of that concern that you are typically have these impulses to want to spend. So I've definitely swung both ways. And again, yes, perhaps there could be the fact that more typically the impulse spending is more of a trait, and it's more of an external noticeable trait, I suppose. So that one definitely, it can, I guess finding out like what is the kind of story behind it. But often we can say, yes, there's an inhibitory control issue. So, executive functioning wise, there's an inhibitory control is that being able to pause before taking action, controlling our immediate urges to respond. So for individuals with ADHD, that kind of inhibitory control is like really leading to maybe more impulsive habits, and then kind of without considering your financial position and the consequences. And that, can lead to instability. And so I guess gently letting the client understand some of that and the impacts it may have without them maybe feeling really defensive about it is probably helpful, because they probably hear that a lot in their life already. They may feel quite criticized and anxious about that part of, and feel embarrassed and shameful. So lots of layers, there's often lots of layers when it comes to these things, that they're probably very well aware about it, but that some people may be really in denial about how serious it actually is.
And I reckon that's why, like, if you are struggling with managing your money, and let's remove ADHD from the conversation for 2 seconds. Like, if you're struggling managing money and you've not been diagnosed with ADHD, you've done all the tests and like, no, there's something else going on. If you did talk to a psychologist and did some basic talk therapy, for me, I found actually just, even if you did schema therapy, how do you respond to situations? Once you say out loud, and it's like, you do this because of this trigger, or this is that. For me, it's a presentness, if that's a word, or being present, an awareness of like, this is a natural proclivity for me to do this. So I have to be aware. And, what I'm working on at the moment is like, okay, before I see you again in 2 weeks or whatever, be aware of this, take note. How's it feel? Don't act on that, or don't. So talk there. It is quite an amazing thing to get some perspective of why you might be acting in a certain way with your money, with your relationships, or whatever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you put it so great that it opens up that conversation. It starts to make those links, and some things that you may not have been aware of, like bringing more awareness to it without shame and judgment. Like, that's the biggest one I often remind clients. It's like, can you just try and just notice these things, come at it with compassion, being like, that's really hard for me. Like, I was really upset at that time, and that's when I spent all that money, or that, there's ways of perhaps repairing. And it is important to forgive yourself when you maybe have had these hiccups along the way, or you have debts to now pay off. It's like, just see it as you having had made mistakes like any human being. And so that compassion component, as well as that being, that mindfulness and awareness, is huge. Like, having someone allow you to kind of be vulnerable and talk about it, removing that cloak of shame, I think can help immensely. It's the same with hoarding, like people who hoard and, like as in like hoarding actual things because like money is a way to collect stuff, and that feels some kind of, it may feel a hole there for some reason, or it is because of the dopamine seeking and that constant, we know the link with dopamine, norepinephrine, that there is a link there, that these spendings do give us that little dopamine hit of like, every time you press it, and Temu, oh my gosh, some of the Temu and there's other apps, like they give you this like 100% off, or like
I had to
like,
delete that
ooh.
because it was too much. I could see it. It was just like you're doing
a slippery
celebration stuff and it's all rubbish anyway. And that leads me kind of to another point around this. Like for me, and it might be other people and yourself might have experienced this, sometimes with that lack of impulse, whether to do with money or other things, before I was really aware of what was happening, it was almost like I just felt like a moth to a light on this autopilot. It's like, oh, I see this, must act on it. It was like, no, you see that. You don't have to act on that. Sit in the pain, sit in the tension.
Discomfort.
Yeah, because I like, it's so weird. And, you know, I joke and say I love dopamine. Like I really love it. But I've had to put financial guardrails in place to protect myself. And that's that awareness of my natural proclivity to do things. So I think my challenge or my comment to anyone who might be struggling with impulsivity is to just, it's okay, slow down, be measured, be considered. And that kind of leads me to like the dance. Like how would you maybe coach someone with future decision making and here in the now dopamine hit?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Like it is important to bring awareness that this may be difficult for the person and building in that like natural, healthy dopamine seeking activities to allow that person to still get those hits, but maybe in a healthier way and not have this heavy reliance on it be through spending. Learning to tolerate, having techniques to tolerate that urge to want to spend. So it is through a lot of hard work or having help with others being around to support that person too. Like it can sometimes be helpful to bring in a partner or, you know, or have them have an accountability buddy. That can be really helpful.
Do you think it's ever helpful if someone found themselves to be really impulsive and out of control to actually give up and be managed by their partner? Like, just give me a card with $200 a week, like, or is that kind of not wanting to address the problem? Or it could be a short stopgap temporarily. I don't know, because we have to fix. I don't know. I would say fix, but we can't really fix ourselves. Like we are who we are, but it's like learning to live productively with ourselves.
So it probably is kind of having a trusting, you know, if that helps a person and it's a good arrangement where they don't feel it's necessarily really inhibiting or it's not that the other person now has all the control. If it's like a healthy, like I'm supporting you with this as opposed to like a financial, like more domestic violence, like controlling, then yes, that perhaps can be really helpful. I do know of many people, including like clients who I've worked with in the past who have said like, yeah, it benefits me only having to kind of have this kind of budget, or we've both agreed that we have our splurge money, you know. So I know that lots of different financial podcasts, including your own, talking about like having these different, I guess, buckets of money, and some of which are kind of locked away and not accessible or much harder to access, you know, that you have got that kind of, you know, amount of money that like you're allowed to splurge on. And maybe that's a good system. Maybe it's great. You know, like you've said to your previous guest, I forget what her name was, but the guest who had ADHD was a little while ago now that you'd interviewed, and kind of really working off that credit card as soon as possible, because those are really slippery slopes to just adding more money. And I even find like with tapping, you know, some people really benefit from having the physical money in their wallet to go, this is the amount of money I can spend for the week, because actually physically seeing it and handing it over is so different than it is just tapping your card. Do you agree?
Yeah, it is. But for me, it was like I had to, and this is it, like I don't want to carry cash, but I know it is better. But that's why I've, you know, and it's weird, like the Glen James spending plan, my budgeting system that I teach, looking back at that, knowing that the way I was, I developed that system to help me manage money well, not knowing I had ADHD. And I'm like, I need to do it this way. But that kind of goes into like that weekly, this is my weekly account. That's all because I tell people like, don't have your other bank on your phone. Just have this bank account. And the problem with other money teachings could be when they say separate all these accounts with the one bank. No. You need some separation. And that leads into the environmental triggers, which for someone who may have ADHD, particularly me, if there is an environmental trigger, that's the moth to the light, like a zombie. And even I don't keep like ice cream in my house because I just can't stop impulse, which was one of the things like the psychologist said the other day. He goes, well, I want you to consciously buy that pint of Ben & Jerry's and only have 2 scoops. And to be very aware, because if I'm on autopilot, I'll eat the whole thing.
Yeah.
So talk to us, in finishing this environmental control and environmental stuff.
Yeah, so it is starting to maybe develop with more awareness and other healthy supports around that you can perhaps strengthen that ability to have that self-trust is a big one, like self-trust that, yes, with mindful spending, mindful eating, that it allows you to actually enjoy it. It allows you to be present, really notice what is happening in your body and what the actions like really are they as rewarding as maybe you kind of had made them up in your mind, that anticipation of it. And often just waiting 5 to 10 minutes, and literally sitting there, do you still want, or I have done strategies where you leave it in a cart on the website, and now they have those kind of reminders sent your way to be like, yeah, you left stuff in your cart, like very, very smart. But often I forget about stuff that I had in my cart. I click out of it. And then if I really still want it and I keeps coming back without necessarily seeing the visuals, like it's something I remember I still would like to grab because for some reason, I couldn't live without it. Then I might give myself permission, but it is often helpful being like, but is that allowed in that, does it allow it in that budget I've kind of set? And yes, like mindfulness is great. It is something that's tricky, and it's whatever you can do. If it's end up slipping and you don't necessarily stop at the 2, don't be mad at yourself and say, well, that was an experiment, didn't work this time, but I can, try again. What was maybe the barriers here? And, maybe it is finding things to soothe yourself before going on a spending spree. Is there some things you actually need, like when you're like, oh, I just need to kind of have like doing some window shopping, or I actually need to do this. What else is going on maybe that actually, could you go to the gym instead? Could you do some movement to finish any distress cycle that may be there that needs finishing, as opposed to going for the quick fixes like tapping your card and bam, that's like, another $200 bag. Is that actually is soothing you, or could you use some other activities that are really quite helpful for your mental well-being and like, good sleep, good exercise, good eating habits as much as possible? They're probably much better than relying on the quick fixes you get through spending. And yeah. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope it really has, encouraged people to take action. I hope it's encouraged people that may be on this journey, that you're not alone, because that's a big thing. We sometimes feel that, oh, this is just me. In finishing, is there anything that you want to say or finish with that maybe I didn't ask you about? Probably the other things I was going to mention is that people have started to share a lot more information about like ADHD friendly budgeting apps. Your spreadsheet and stuff sounds amazing. So I think it is utilizing those tools as an ADHDer, and especially from ADHDers themselves, maybe have found really quick and easy tools, little shortcuts, or just really great ways of managing their own finances better. So I think that's really important. And, outsourcing, delegating those things that just don't inspire you. Like myself, I'm a business owner and it doesn't inspire me to do a lot of the financial stuff. I am on the hunt for a good bookkeeper. I have an accountant who has been assisting, but I do think that I need someone, to more regularly really stay on top of my books. I need to still submit my BAS statement.
Oh, if you need a bookkeeper,
all
I can introduce you to mine. He's great.
Amazing. So yeah, it's that kind of stuff that, like, learning to what's like the Eisenhower Tower is a great one to really like figure out for yourself, like what is urgent and important to do yourself, what is important but not what is urgent but not important to you to delegate, what is like, what is important but not urgent to pause and to like put on the schedule. And what are things that are neither urgent or important, and to try and just like throw those right in the bin. So it is that some system can help people as well to know what doesn't inspire them to delegate those things if possible, or get support around, like myself. It has really changed a lot for me. Like it's made a big difference.
Are there any books or resources that come to mind other than your podcast, ADHD Her Way?
Yes, and I will probably do, like, it's now like impulsivity and that has kind of been something that has been talked about a bit more by others as well. So it probably is something I will cover in my episode, but not necessarily like things that come. No, I like, to be honest, and this may be something for you to now explore a bit more. ADHD friendly, like budgeting books and that. I personally haven't, but look, not the most familiar with this space. It's admittedly something I have avoided.
Yeah, well, my challenge to you, Johanna, and just for your own information, I honestly think the Glen James spending plan is ADHD friendly because it was designed to stop impulses, help you save money, out of sight, out of mind, work on the spending behaviours. And the only reason I've been financially successful is because I've had to really do that budget and system to protect myself. But within this, it works well because, like the weekly spending account, I always say it gives the spenders limits, but it also gives the savers permission to spend, because that's also a big thing. If you're saving money, you need permission to spend and not feel guilty about buying a $5 coffee one day a week if you want one.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. It's so non-restrictive. It's that not all or nothing thinking, that you still give permission to do the nice things and allow money for that. And then it's not, I guess that rebelling doesn't happen where you go, I'm going to throw it all down the drain now because I'm done.
And so for me, I've got financial guardrails, and in the Glen James Spending Plan online course, it's free. If you're new to this podcast today and you've stumbled across it, the Glen James Spending Plan is free. There's a heap of videos. I put guardrails in my own life. So for example, I don't spend more than 1% of my gross income without sleeping on it. Now, that could be different from different stages. It might be, pick a number, 0.5%. If you earned 80 grand a year, you're not spending more than $800 in one go without sleeping on it. Make it 0.5%. I'm not spending $400 in one go. Make it $100. Whatever that is, have a guardrail in place for you to deal with this stuff. Yeah. And have your savings out of sight, out of mind. It's amazing how much I can save when I'm not looking at the amounts every day. Yeah,
I agree. Like, I love how you can set up systems that just naturally work quite well. But it is important to provide that. One thing I do like doing, I have to admit, is like if you're a part of app, like if you have an Apple app and you see all your subscriptions are like really laid out or whatever, it's to really do like a clean of all the things that you've subscribed to, and quite frequently just like get rid of the ones you like impulsively joined, and doing that frequently and see that as part of self-care. I think, if we can really come at the budget idea as something of self-care as opposed to being restrictive, that I think can help that money story a lot as well, that it's actually much more forgiving. And I think that it's then a more helpful, self-compassionate thing to do for yourself. Absolutely.
Totally. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on This Is Money. Johanna, I'm sure just Instagram, Johanna Badenhorst, her podcast, ADHD Her Way. You can Google her if you want a clinical session, telehealth and all that stuff. There'll be information on her website. But thank you so much, Johanna, for joining me today.
No, that's all right. You can find me on holisticwellnesspsychology.com.au. That's where my website is, and all my podcast stuff and that is on there too, as well as on my 2 Instagram pages, Holistic Wellness Psychology and ADHD Her Way.
Perfect. Thanks for joining us.